Good evening. We're continuing our videos that you may or may not be watching. If we decide not to go back to face-to-face, this is what we're doing instead. To get you up to date, we're covering study questions 8 and 9 for the second exam. Remember that I moved that exam 1 week, exactly 1 week, to accommodate the extra week of spring break. And we're covering the nadir of American race relations. And I was about to talk about segregation laws, but previously we had talked about disenfranchisement laws. Let me write that word down so you're familiar with the term, what disenfranchisement is. So disenfranchisement, the franchise is the right to vote. So disenfranchisement laws are laws that strip away voting rights. And we talked about poll taxes and literacy tests. We talked about how those two measures, without violating technically the 15th Amendment, because I didn't mention race, color, or previous condition of servitude, took voting rights away from for black people. We talked about how white people were initially affected by those laws, but then they implemented grandfather clauses, which allowed white people who couldn't afford the poll tax or the literacy tests, or pass the literacy tests, to basically vote anyway. They were exempt from those requirements because they had an ancestor who could vote before the Civil War. It made the right to vote hereditary, again, without violating the 3 restrictions imposed by the 15th Amendment. There was one other type of disenfranchisement law I wanted to mention. This is in Texas, something called the white primary. So when we get to the early 20th century, Texas is devising all these schemes to keep black people from voting. And one way they did it is to create this particular political mechanism. Primaries are held by parties to nominate people for the general election in November. Now, the Democrats had primaries, the Republicans had primaries, but in that era, Democrats won, after the fall of the populace, almost every election. They had a monopoly on political power, essentially, in Texas. The only primaries that mattered in this era were Democratic Party primaries. So what the state legislature did in Texas was to designate the Democratic Party a private organization, a private club, essentially. And as private clubs, they could designate who were members and therefore who could participate in the primaries. That was the ruse they followed. They were arguing that this isn't a function of government determining who would be on the ballot in November. This is a function of a private organization. And so the Democratic Party designated the membership as being whites only. You could not vote in Democratic primaries if you're white. Now that will get overturned. And this is one of the decisions that eventually leads to a lot of sweeping civil rights decisions based in Texas. Smith versus Allwright. The Smith there, by the way, is a gentleman from Dallas, Maceo Smith, who was a leader in the civil rights movement in the city of Dallas. 1944, they ruled that the all-white primary in Texas was unconstitutional. And you begin to see cracks in the disenfranchisement laws with that decision. Now, disenfranchisement wasn't the only strategy that whites in the South, after the Reconstruction, implement in order to prevent a union between struggling and poor whites and African Americans. They did, with these laws, make voting a white privilege. And I want to get back to the concept of the zero-sum game. They're trying to make white people feel invested, even if they're poor, in the status quo. They're trying to give them things that they feel they might lose if the system changes. And by making voting a white privilege again, like it had been before the Civil War, they're trying to restore that sense that all whites have something in common. All white people have solidarity, even if only a few whites have real power. So that's one thing. Another thing they try is they're trying to drive a wedge between blacks and whites through segregation laws. Earlier in the semester, we talked about the black codes that were passed during Reconstruction, these are not exactly the same as the black codes. Segregation laws focus on one thing: physical space. The black codes during Reconstruction prohibited African Americans specifically from owning guns, from serving on juries, from running from office, etc., etc. Those laws were undone by the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the laws. The segregation laws specifically deal with the spaces that white people are allowed to occupy and black people are. They aim at separating the races. What motivates this? Very simple. If white and black people don't live together, don't swim in the same pools, don't eat at the same restaurants, don't go to the same bars, don't go to the same barber shops, don't sit in the same seats on the subways or the trains or whatever. If they don't occupy spaces next to each other, it's harder for them to form political alliances, friendships, relationships that create the bonds that can create a movement. That's what they're specifically trying to do, is create physical separation. So we have these laws implemented, again, really while the populist movement is going on, but they accelerate after the populist movement collapses. Now, we need to clarify some things. First of all, the types of segregation and also who they apply to. So one thing I want to talk about first is the one-drop rule. So these segregation laws are going to say this school is for whites only. This school is for blacks only. They're going to say that this neighborhood is for whites only. This neighborhood is for blacks only. These seats on the train are only for black customers. These are for only white customers. But there's a fundamental problem you have if you pass a law like that. You have to define what black and white mean. And that's tricky because, in fact, over the centuries since that slave ship arrived in Virginia in 1619, whites and blacks had children together, usually through rape. White slave masters had raped slave women for centuries. And millions of African Americans have white ancestry, and millions of so-called black people have white ancestry. The racial borders had been crossed repeatedly through sexual contact, often unwilling. So who's black and who's white? You know, if you're going to say this is for whites only, you have to be able to define what white means. So they adopted the simplest possible rule. That is, if you had, quote unquote, one drop of black blood, you were a black person. Now, let's be clear. There is no such thing as a black drop of blood or a white drop of blood. It's all red. It's all chemically the same. And in fact, as we discussed, human life originated in Ethiopia. The first humans were black. The first Europeans were black. We're thoroughly blended. War, colonization, slavery, etc. We're very effective at, as the racists used to say, mixing races. But nevertheless, if you had a known black ancestor under these laws, which are passed all across the South, you became black, even if it was only your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. You know, because people lived in the same community for generations. People knew that family connection. If you had that known black ancestor, no matter how many white ancestors you had, you became a black person. And so did all your descendants. Now, that serves the function, first of all, of making enforcing these laws really easy. Secondly, it discourages something. Because, again, they want to separate what black and white people to prevent communities from forming politically that might oppose the status quo, change the power structure. And so these laws criminalized what was called miscegenation. That is when you have sexual contact between white and black people, when you marry, black and white people marry, that became against the law. That became a criminal act. And by the way, these laws were on the books for a very long time. There were laws before the Civil War. During Reconstruction, Tennessee passed an anti-miscegenation law in 1870. Actually, this shocks me. I mean, I should be not shocked by anything as an historian, but every time I think of this, it really rattles me because this is in my lifetime. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1966 said that these anti-miscegenation laws, making it a crime for people to marry across racial lines, were unconstitutional. And it's wonderful. The name of the decision, Loving versus Virginia. You're going to have a hard time reading that. But Loving versus Virginia. There was a couple. The man's name was Loving. His last name was Loving. He was white. He was from Virginia. He married a black woman outside of Virginia. They came back to Virginia. The wife was harassed. They were subject to legal harassment. And when they decided to challenge the laws, it got to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1966. Using the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws, the implied right to privacy in the Constitution, the courts overturned that law. While I was in first grade, it is shocking for me to realize I was learning to read and write. There were still laws in the country that banned interracial marriage. But anyway, so the one-drop rule, that's an important thing to remember. Now, given that, that's the basis for the segregation laws. We define who's black and white, and we say certain spaces in the public are for black people, certain spaces for white people. You're not supposed to cross those boundaries. There are two types of segregation. The first type is the one you're more familiar with, de jure. That's from Latin. It means by law. Segregation by law. In other words, they put a law on the books that mandates the African Americans to stay out of certain places, and white people have that place to their own. This is whites only restaurant. This is a whites only seat. This is a whites only movie theater or whatever. And it's written down on the books. And this can be in the Constitution of a state. It can be a law passed by a legislature, passed by a city, ordinance passed by a city. An example of this is when the Redeemer Democrats, the racist Democrats who had supported the Confederacy, take power over Texas again in the mid-1870s. During Reconstruction, they adopt a constitution in 1876, which is still the one we have operating today. And in that constitution, it says specifically, there shall be separate schools provided for black and white students. It's written in law. And so these laws are all over the South. I have to say this, when we talk about segregation, there are segregation laws in the North. That's not discussed as often. It's not only a Southern thing, but it's primarily something that happens and it pervades every aspect of life in former Confederate states. So that's what we, like the laws that said there were certain separate seating for black and white passengers on buses. We know about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. That's because of a de jure segregation law. There's another important one. And in fact, this actually, we see this in the North as well as the South. So I want to give you some examples here, first of all, of de jure segregation. We'll talk about this in a second, that we, for instance, it says colored waiting room. It's going to be the train stations where these first happen. Now, before I go on to de facto, I do need to mention one thing. These de jure laws, these segregation laws, come to be known as Jim Crow laws. And I have to explain what that means, because you'll see that in books very often. The de jure laws, the whole practice of segregation, de facto segregation is also called Jim Crow. De facto means by practice. It's custom. It's not in the law books. It's by custom. Let me real quickly refer to that. We have in America this really peculiar tradition called minstrelsy. Minstrel shows. Now, what is a minstrel show? Well, let me show you a little artifact here. This is the most famous minstrel artist in American history, and it's a man named Al Jolson. Here we go. This is a movie, 1927, called The Jazz Singer. Al Jolson's a white singer and actor. The movie is about this character who is a cantor, or he's trained to be a cantor in a synagogue. His family is Jewish, but he's not interested in doing that. He wants to be a jazz singer, and he's a minstrel performer. What does this mean? Minstrel shows are shows where white actors put on burnt cork or other black makeup and portray black people. And these shows, they imitate black dialect. They imitate black music. They very often, Al Jolson is dressed pretty nicely here, but typically in these stage shows, and that's how they originated. They began really in the 1830s. On the stage shows, very often they dress ridiculously. They dress kind of like circus clowns. They're supposed to look ridiculous. They often wear woolly wigs in imitation of black hair. They very often, you'll note the white makeup around the lips to exaggerate, because the stereotype of African American lips supposedly being more prominent than white lips. They're really aimed to make black appearance look ridiculous. That's the goal. Now, it really starts in the 1820s. It takes off in the 1830s. There's a man named T.D. Big Daddy Rice who becomes a major star in New York City, doing the first minstrel shows. And these minstrel shows had all these performers in what's called blackface. And there were standard characters in these minstrel shows. And they sing and they dance and they do comedy sketches. Sometimes they make fun of the politics of the time or the celebrities of the time. It was sort of like a demented, racist version of Saturday Night Live. And these were live shows, stage shows that go on for a century. And they have standard characters, like I said. One was called, and I have to apologize because the term is racist. There's a character named Zip Coon. Coon is an anti-black slur. And he's a pretentious African-American who thinks he's far, superior and, the top of the heap and everything. Really important. Really impressed with himself. And then there's a companion of that character whose name is Jim Crow. Now, this really shows the cruelty of this humor. The humor aims at belittling black people, although at the same time, it's sort of grounded in this grudging admiration of black culture, black music, etc. But there's a real condescending nature to it. So the Jim Crow character, who's a slave, who's very happy-go-lucky, good-natured, the message you would get from that is slaves were happy being slaves, was based on someone, the man I mentioned, Rice, encountered. A disabled stableman. A man who walked with a really pronounced limp. And so Rice, who writes a bunch of songs based on black music forms, bad imitations of black music forms, saw this man and he was limping. And he was kind of walking like this, where his leg would rise up. And so he wrote a song called Jump Jim Crow, making fun of him not only for his race, but his disability, how he walked. And that became a standard thing. Minstrel shows had different scripts. They had different, they did things in different order, different performers. They were performed all over the country in these live theaters or on stage at country fairs. But these characters were standard, and Jim Crow was a character. And by the way, a lot of classic American songs were minstrel songs. Stephen Foster became one of the most famous American songwriters of the 19th century. There's a song called Oh Susanna. You can look up on YouTube if you haven't heard it. The Old Folks at Home. Those were minstrel songs. Our culture is deeply rooted in that. And something odd happens. American culture is weird. That's admitted. So these were big shows, popular. Even people who racially and their attitudes were way ahead of their times, like Mark Twain, were fans of minstrel shows. So there's money to be made. One African American, William Henry Lane, realized there was money to be made in minstrel shows. He was black. He said, I can do black music better than white folks. I can do black dialect better than white folks. So here's what he did. He became a minstrel performer. He would put on black makeup and go on stage playing minstrel characters. So I want you to think about this. He was a black man pretending to be a white man, pretending to be a black man. Work that out. He was very popular. Now, one thing that's really important about these Jim Crow performers is substantial, more than 95% of the African American population before the Civil War and even right after the Civil War lived in the South. And so Northern whites very often based all their attitudes, their impressions of black people based on what they saw in minstrel shows. And the shows were demeaning and made black people look foolish, pretentious, not very smart. They were punchlines. That's what the impression was based on. And it's remarkable how durable this art form was. First talkie film, as I said, we showed you Al Jolson, the jazz singer. That was 1927. That was the movie that's often called the first film with a soundtrack. Now, that's not quite true. There were other movies that had it, and the film does have parts where it's a silent movie, and then there's sound where you hear Al Jolson singing, but it's credited as the first one, and it features someone in minstrelsy. The most popular radio program in the 1930s. Radio, they used to broadcast comedies, music shows, dramas, all sorts of programming that would later be features of television. The most popular radio program in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, when this radio programs like that began to die out, was Amos and Andy, which featured two white actors. And here's the odd thing, they're on radio, so think about that. They would perform in blackface while they were performing on radio. And that became actually a TV show in the 1950s for a couple of seasons, where they used black actors instead of white actors in blackface. What is really ironic and sad in some ways, the show was clearly based on racist ideas, but it was a show with black actors, and you didn't see that many other places. All the characters were black, but the NAACP, aware of the racist history of minstrelsy, led a petition drive, and they canceled the show. And when you saw black people on TV in the 50s, the rest of the decade, primarily they were servants, butlers, maids, etc. And they were never prime characters until you got to the late 1960s when some black actresses and actors began to play prominent roles in TV shows. Now, one other thing before I go on and resume my talk about de facto and de jure segregation. You want to know how long this lasted? When I did my book on Dallas, I've got a copy here, White Metropolis, I was going through hundreds and hundreds of issues of the newspaper. And in the 1960s, clubs like the Masons, the Elks Club, etc., would have club notices in the newspaper where they say, we're doing a fundraiser, we're going to do a minstrel show for a fundraiser. So that's in my lifetime that you still had minstrelsy featured. Now I want to go back to the discussion. So Jim Crow refers to segregation. We talked about de jure segregation. Again, let's go through some of these photos again. I want to show you we'll talk about how pervasive this is, but I want to show you, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about how train stations were the first places we begin to have Jim Crow laws passed. So train stations, you had segregation. You had also water fountains, famously. Here's a photo. Note, white, and they always use the term colored for water fountains, restrooms, etc. So this is going to pervade all aspects of life. You also have, by the way, businesses would often have signs like this. We cater to white trade only, which means the sign they're announcing, if you're black, we don't want you here. Stay out of here. And this was generally understood. But there's another type of insidious segregation which is not based on laws. The de jure segregation was based on law. That's de facto segregation, which in Latin means segregation in fact. In other words, in practice, by custom. And we see this all over the country. African Americans simply know that there's some places that you shouldn't go if you don't want to have your nose broken or worse. There are places called sundown towns. Let me write that down. These are all over the country. What does that mean? Basically, African Americans are welcome in the town to do work, low-paid work, as butlers, maids, to work in the fields, whatever. When the sun sets, though, the men in particular, but African Americans, period, are expected to leave and go to where they live. And all kinds of terrible things can happen if you're caught in the town afterwards because of the racism of the time. There's assumption, and particularly if you're a man, that you're up to no good. You're planning to rob someone, break into homes, or rape a white woman. And so you're supposed to leave, and sometimes lynchings happen in these sundown towns. And I mean, it's not very subtle. Greenville, Texas, and East Texas had, through the 1960s, a sign over the main street that said the blackest soil. You know, this cotton growing area, so they're talking about the richness of the soil. The blackest soil and the whitest people. And black people were supposed to keep away from the white parts of town, and many towns they weren't welcome at all after sunset. Now, this happens in the North too, de facto segregation. Terrible example is in 1919, which is the year after World War I ends. And so we had a lot of racial tension in the United States. African Americans moved north. There's something called the Great Migration, where hundreds of thousands or more African Americans moved from the South to the North because jobs are available, because millions of white soldiers are signed up. They're getting the military, particularly after 1917 when the U.S. enters the war. There are jobs available. Weapons are being manufactured, etc. That will lead to tension, which leads to a terrible tragedy in Chicago based on de facto segregation in 1919. We'll talk about that next time.